Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 197, December 23rd to December 29th, 1864. Last week we talked about the bigger picture, where we are right now, how far we've come so far in the year 1864. We also talked about George Stoneman, who launched a raid into Southwest Virginia here in 1864. He's actually going to do it again here in 1865, but this is his 1864 raid we talked about last episode. This week, we need to backtrack just a bit. In fact, we need to backtrack all the way to July to discuss Lovell Rousseau's raid, which, much like the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, was neglected in our narrative. Before we talk about Lovell Rousseau, though, and his raid, we do need to talk about our Patreon content. And of course, we do have some Patreon content posted. We just did top 10 battlefield monuments here. That is up there. There's a whole bunch of movie reviews, a whole bunch of memoir reviews, and some picture slideshow as well of modern day battlefields. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description, and the proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. Now, we actually also are having as a special bonus episode here at the end of 1864, we're actually going to have a rundown of the movies that we've covered so far, talking a little bit about each of them, ranking each of them as well, and we're going to talk about some of our superlatives for items that we've covered and the Patreon feed. So hopefully, if this brief blurb here in these episodes doesn't sound like it would interest you, then maybe there would be something of interest here in the next episode that will be posted here on the regular narrative feed. So, once again, greatly appreciated. Thank you all so much for your support. Lovell Rousseau is an interesting character, being from Kentucky. While proving to be at least a capable officer in some of our previous events, he has been on the sideline due to being a Democrat, and also annoying the War Office during the Tullahoma and Chickamauga campaigns. As such, he will be sent to northern Alabama to oversee operations there. While Sherman was pressuring Atlanta, Rousseau would have the responsibility of raiding and disrupting the railroad in Alabama. Remember that Sherman has a goal of investing the city and cutting off all lines of supply. Well, Rousseau is going to set out with 2,700 men, a little less than half armed with Spencer repeating carbines. We have an account from a correspondent that goes over the raid in detail, so we will unroll this as maybe you would see it when reading a newspaper back in 1864. A raid upon the rear of Johnston's army and cutting of his line of communication having been decided upon by General Sherman, the important duty of carrying it out was entrusted to Major General Rousseau. The preparatory orders to him were issued about the 1st of July, and the command was to be organized out of such materials as were at hand. Several regiments of cavalry in his district, which would necessarily form a part, were only partly mounted, and were scattered at different points along the railroad. They were, however, gathered together and sent promptly as possible to Decatur, Alabama, from which point the expedition was to start. You remember, of course, Decatur, Alabama as being significant during Hood's movement eventually into Tennessee. The command was divided into two brigades, the first commanded by Colonel T.J. Harrison, 8th Indiana, the second by Colonel Hamilton, 9th Ohio, composed as follows. 1st Brigade, 8th Indiana Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Jokes, 8th Iowa Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel M.T. Patrick, 2nd Kentucky Cavalry, Lieutenant Colonel Watts, 2nd Brigade, 9th Ohio Cavalry, 4th Tennessee Cavalry, Major Stevens, and 2 guns of Battery E, 1st Michigan Artillery, Lieutenant Whiteman. General Rousseau reached Decatur on the 9th of July on the evening of the same day. The last detachments of the different regiments, which were to compose the command, also arrived, and preparations were made for starting the next day. Sunday the 10th was a busy day in camp. Anything but a Sabbath like still prevailed. In the morning, horses were issued to regiments yet in need of them. Tents, extra clothing, and other articles not necessary for the trip were packed up to be left behind, and the bustle of preparation was visible in every quarter. No vehicles were to be taken except 5 ambulances for the transportation of the sick and wounded. The whole command was put in a light marching order so as to move with clarity. The necessary articles, such as ammunition, axes, being transported on pack mules. The men were not allowed to carry any extra clothing except a shirt and a pair of socks for a change. Even blankets were to be left behind. Everything betokened that the movement was one that required rapidity of execution. 15 days' rations of salt, coffee, and sugar, 5 of hard bread, and 1 of bacon were issued to the men, and carried in their haversacks. Subsistence for the rest of the trip was to be obtained to the country to be traversed by the command. To provide against lameness of the horses from loose of shoes, each man carried with him 2 shoes, fitted for his horse, and nails sufficient for fastening them. That's something probably you don't really think about when you're thinking about these cavalry raids, is that, if you have horseshoes, you probably need to carry extra horseshoes. So if you're a cavalryman, I think we might have actually talked about this in one of our Patreon episodes when we talked about Harvey Kidd. He was talking a lot about, at one point, about horseshoes. In the afternoon, everything was ready. The bugle sounded forward and the command moved out. Starting out in a southeasterly direction, the expedition took the road towards Somerville, a county seat 15 miles from Decatur. The road crosses Flint River 7 miles out and passes over a country generally of flat surface. Somerville was reached about 9 o'clock at night, and the command bivouacked until morning. A forage train accompanied it with it far for corn, horses, the wagons returning to Decatur next day. Henceforward, the horses were to take the chances of such forage as the country afforded along the route. July 11th. The expedition was now fairly started into the enemy's country, and judging from the rations issued, was not likely to return to our own lines in less than 2 weeks. The direction pursued was about the same as before, southeast. The distance marched was about 30 miles, and in the evening, the command bivouacked on Sand Mountain, the dividing ridge, which separates the waters flowing into the Tennessee River and then flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. The country was generally poor and afforded but a scanty supply of forage for the horses. Sand Mountain, if you recall, was actually a site of a skirmish during Able Strait's raid, Forrest Command skirmishing with the Union Army there. July 12th, descending Sand Mountain in the morning, the expedition forded Black Warrior River, a tributary of the Tombigbee, and at 10 o'clock reached Blountsville, the county seat of Blount County. In the jail here were rounded 2 deserters from Johnson's army and 4 Negroes charged with the crime of seeking their liberty. All were released. A prisoner charged with murder was in confinement in the same jail and was left to await trial at the hands of the civil authorities. Beyond Blountsville, the road crosses Straight Mountain, the descent of which is remarkably steep and rugged, but was passed without incident, and the command halted for the night in a fertile valley, where a good supply of oats was obtained for the horses. On this day's march, the first armed rebels were met, a small party of them having fired on the advance guard on the mountain and then fled. Their shots were ineffective. A regiment was sent forward in the night to Asheville, 5 miles, to secure any supplies the rebels might have at the point. A sufficient quantity of corn for the horses was obtained, and also a quantity of flour and bacon. July 13th, the command marched into Asheville in the morning and remained for several hours, getting the horses completely shot up. All places of business were closed, and a number of the citizens had fled in terror at the approach of the dreaded Yankees. The printing office of the county paper was deserted by the proprietors and printers, leaving the forms on the press, the edition being party worked off. The paper contained Vallandigham's speech at Hamilton, Ohio, and an editorial article eulogized Vallandigham as a gifted statesman, orator, and patriotic exile. The editor further shows the following, looking to the peace of the party of the North for aid in sustaining the rebellion. Several printers were detailed and sent to the office, and the press was soon put to use, never anticipated by its owner, printing orders and blanks for the Yankee command. The printers also amused themselves by taking out a column of secession stuff from the form of the Vedette, and inserting a short editorial changing the tone of the paper, and also some items concerning the arrival of General Rousseau's command. A few copies of the new edition were worked off before the command again took up the line of march. In the afternoon, the march was continued over the rough barren country, and in the evening the expedition reached the Coosa River at Greenport. Here it was expected that the rebels would attempt to delay, as if they could gather any force, as news of our approach had no doubt been sent forward. none were to be seen by the bank of the river. The ferry boat was on the opposite side, and was gained possession by a party swimming over. General Rousseau at once ordered a detachment of 300 men to be crossed to hold the ferry, and in the night the artillery was also ferried the river, to prevent a delay in the morning. Here the 5th Iowa performed the duty of interring the remains of one of its most efficient officers, Captain William Kerr. The regiment was up in the rear, and Captain Curl and Captain Wilcox of the same regiment were riding together a little separated from their companies, when they were fired upon by 6 men, who had concealed themselves in the bushes by the roadside. The rebels demanded their surrender before firing, but officers attempted to escape, and they were fired on the rear, and Captain Curl instantly killed. Captain Wilcox was severely but not dangerously wounded, 8 buckshot having penetrated his thigh. An inspection of the cannon was made. All men who, from sickness or other causes, were not likely to endure the hardships of the march, were also called out and sent, with the disabled horses, to Gunnersville, on the Tennessee River, about 40 miles distant. An ambulance was also sent to convey Captain Wilcox and other disabled. They subsequently arrived safely within our lines. Now, just as a point here to make, we talked about how northern Alabama is actually, pretty pro-Union, right? There are Alabama units serving in the Northern Army, but we also have the Southern populace. We also have guerrillas in this area. And remember, we had Turchin with his pretty violent reprisal, burning an Alabama town. That was partly because of guerrilla activity in this vicinity. And here we have another example here as reported. July 14th. At daylight, the column was in motion, preparing to cross the river. At the ferry, the Coosa is a deep stream about 300 yards wide, but with little current. 4 miles further down, at 10 islands, it spreads out to a greater width and is fordable. The detachment under command of Major Graham of the 8th Indiana, which had crossed the ferry, was ordered to move down east to cover the ford, while the main column proceeded down the west to cross at the fording. Major Graham met the enemy immediately after leaving the ferry, and a lively skirmish at once commenced. The rebels were strongly posted in the woods, commanding the road. Skirmishers were thrown out, and the rebels were found to be in considerable force, and in a position to delay the advance of the small party. They were, however, pressed back slowly by our skirmishers. Meanwhile, the main column reached the ford, and at the head of it commenced crossing. On emerging from between 2 islands, and having yet a width of 300 yards to cross, it was met by heavy fire from the rebels, strongly posted behind rocks and trees on the bank. To attempt to force a passage would have been to incur a heavy loss, and the advance withdrew behind an island, under cover of which they replied vigorously to the rebels' fire. Lieutenant Colonel Patrick also placed the 4th Tennessee on a larger island below and in the rear of the first name, and the men of that regiment and of the 5th Iowa were deployed as sharpshooters, and from behind trees exchanged shots with the rebels, who were similarly posted on the bank. 2 companies were sent to look for a ford, reported to be 2 miles down the river, but failed to find it. A detachment of 100 men was sent across the ferry to reinforce Major Graham, to enable him to drive the rebels from his front and attack in the rear of those posted at the ford. Colonel Jones of the 8th Indiana was afterwards sent with the rest of the regiment for the same purpose. But the work was finally accomplished by Major Graham before his arrival. While the main column was thus delayed at the river, a fordable place was found about a mile below, and General Rousseau was about throwing a detachment across when the rebels silently disappeared from the flank. Major Graham having succeeded in driving them from his front and forward, killing some 15 of them, 2 of whom were officers, one being General Clanton's assistant adjutant general, wounding about 40 and capturing several prisoners, among whom were Lieutenant Colonel Larry and Major McWhirter of the 6th Alabama Cavalry. The force opposed to us proved to be part of the 6th and 8th Alabama Cavalry, with militia and such other troops as could be hastily put together, and was commanded by Brigadier General Clanton. But one man was injured on the Federal side, and he was wounded by a comrade who mistook him for a rebel. The ford being cleared, the column commenced crossing. The passage of the river was a beautiful sight. The long array of horsemen winding between the green islands and taking a serpentine course across the ford, their arms flashing back the rays of the burning sun, and guidons gaily fluttering along the column, formed a bright picture recalling the days of romance, and contrasting sharply with the stern hardships and vivid realities of the everyday life of the duty march. The ford had been passed by General Jackson during his campaign against the Creek Indians. Without further delay, the march was resumed. The day was very hot and intolerably dusty. A few miles from the river we reached an iron furnace, which was being operated for the rebel authorities. It was thoroughly destroyed by General Rousseau's orders. After a march of 15 miles, a halt was made for about 2 hours to feed and rest. The heat of the day was very trying, particularly upon the artillery horses, and finding that to retain both guns would impede the march and prevent the rapidity of movement which was essential to the success of the expedition, General Rousseau promptly decided to destroy one and attach the extra horses to the other, so that it could be moved along the same gait the cavalry marched. It was speedily dismounted, the trunnions broken off, and the carriage destroyed. The night was cool and pleasant, and the moon shone brightly. The march was continued until midnight, when the command halted at Estawaba, 25 miles from the Coosa. The country traversed was more fertile and better improved than any reached previously. July 15th. At daylight, the men were again in their saddles and on the road. Passing many large farms with good fields of corn, wheat, and oats, we reached Talladega about 10 o'clock. Here we struck a railroad extending from Selma in the northeast direction, originally intended to connect with Rome, Georgia, but only completed to Blue Mountain, a few miles north of Talladega. The road was of no significant importance in reference to present military operations. A small rebel force left Talladega a few hours before our approach and moved down the railroad to the bridge over the Coosa River, our coming having been heard of, and the destruction of that bridge being supposed by them to be one of the objects of the expedition. They were unable, however, to remove their commissary stores and other supplies, which fell into our hands. About 100,000 rations of sugar, salt, and 20,000 rations of flour and bacon, and a number of boxes of tobacco were taken. The command were supplied with what they needed and the rest destroyed. The railroad depot was burned, with the contents consisting of leather, niter, grain sacks, 100 sacks of flour, 300 bushels of wheat, 500 bushels of salt, 4 platform scales, and a lot of shoes, cotton, and other articles. 2 freight cars on the track were also burned. In the hospital were 143 sick and wounded, all of which were paroled. A gun factory in town, which has done a large amount of work for the rebel army, principally in the way of repairing, was effectually destroyed by breaking the machinery. The building itself could not be burned without destroying a part of the town, which General Rousseau would not permit to be done. Another larger establishment of the same kind outside the town was destroyed by the rebels themselves before leaving. Several cases or muskets were found stored in a stable and were destroyed. After resting a few hours in the heat of the day, the command again moved at 4 o'clock in the evening. Direction was nearly south, and gave the rebels the impression that the Coosa Bridge was the point aimed at. From Montgomery and some of the papers afterward obtained, it was learned that they were convinced that such were the object, and disposed their forces accordingly, which no doubt saved the command considerable annoyance, as our route was left clear. Removing the direction of Montgomery, the news caused great consternation in the rebel capital. Marching until midnight, the command passed the little village of Sylacauga. Sorry, guys, I gotta tell you, a lot of these names are very foreign to me, right? So if you are from northern Alabama, and I very much apologize if this is a real place, and I'm kind of butchering the pronunciation. And halted 25 miles from Talladega, unannoyed by the rebels, who were no doubt busily at work fortifying themselves to the bridge, which we had perhaps 20 miles to our rear and right. Having had but 2 or 3 hours sleep the previous night, the wearisome march through the day, the men were nearly overcome with fatigue and drowsiness, and as soon as the halt was made, dropped themselves on the ground to seek repose. July 16th. An early start on a march of 15 miles brought the command to Bradford, where a cotton factory was in operation. Here a halt was made and several hours' rest taken. A case of barbarous punishment occurred recently in the vicinity of Sacapatoy, a village a mile or 2 from Bradville, which would be incredible were it not supported by the testimony of eyewitness, and had not slavery and secession together turned men into fiends. A negro charged with having killed his master was arrested by the citizens of the neighborhood, tied to a tree and burned to death. His torture was no doubt, to some extent, mitigated by the very means used to make it severe. Dry pitch pine was piled up closely around him, which burned so rapidly and poured out such a dense smoke that he was almost instantly suffocated. A witness stated that he never screamed or groaned, but seemed to suffocate at once. We have had other instances, right, when we talked about Milliken's Bend, where there were individuals who recounted burnings of not only the enslaved, but also Union individuals as well in this region, and it's kind of used as sort of a tall tale, right? Kind of propaganda, if you will. So it's hard to tell whether this is 100% true. It very well might have been, but it also could have been kind of as just a story. At Youngville, a quantity of rebel grain and bacon was obtained, In every county, there are several depots for receiving the tax in kind imposed by the Confederate government, being 1/10 of all the productions of the soil. These are gathered in by agents and sent off wherever ordered for the supply of the army. At these points, the expedition found supplies ready for their use. Remember, we also talked about tax in kind, in that it is not a particularly effective system for the Confederates. They don't have the logistical structure to support this. So a lot of these supplies are actually just going to be where they are. We're found, case in point, Lovell Rousseau is finding them in these depots. They're not actually where the army should be, right? So that they're a nice example of the problem. July 17th. The expedition was now within 1 day's march of the Atlanta and Montgomery Railroad, a road of the utmost importance to the rebel army, being the one over which the greater portion of their supplies were drawn, and forming the line of communication with the Southwest. General Rousseau determined to push rapidly forward to reach it before nightfall. Just as the command was about starting, the Vedettes fired upon a small party approaching them, and succeeded in capturing 2 and killing 1. The one killed was a Captain Mason, in command of a scouting party from Dadeville, on the way to destroy the ferry and prevent our crossing. Rumors of our approach having reached them, but with no definitiveness. They were all too late to accomplish their object. No other party of rebels was met during the day. Passing through Dadeville, the march was continued toward the railroad of Lochapaca Station. About sundown, the command reached Lochapaca and in possession of the railroad. No force was there and all was quiet. We had penetrated into the rear of the rebel army and were now on their most important line of communication. Working parties were at once detailed and the work of destruction commenced. The character of the superstructure of the railroad was peculiarly favorable for the purpose. The ties were of pine and the track was laid out of iron, spiked to pine timbers, set into every fourth tie. These longitudinal stringers were readily raised from their position by means of fence rails used as levers. 20 or 30 men would raise 100 feet at a time on one side, and place the timber and rail on top of the rail on the other side. Fence rails and the other combustible material were then piled in, and a fire started. The result of the operation was the destruction of the timbers, the complete warping of the iron rails from the expansion by the intense heat, and the burning of the ties where the track rested upon them, so as to make them utterly unserviceable. No other road, perhaps, could do thorough a destruction be effected by such simple means. The pine was of pitchy character, and burned so readily that the ties were completely destroyed, without raising them from the roadbed, and the iron was thoroughly drawn out of shape by the heat. The track was not merely torn up, but it was destroyed, lies, iron, and other material being rendered unfit to use again. So we talked about, Sherman neckties. It seems a lot easier here, where they're just starting a fire, and essentially that's going to do it. There's not as much work that they have to do, right? And that's also a nice example of how the South is not quite the same in terms of industry as the North. They have these subpar materials building one of the only railroads that are in the area. During the night, the railroad depot, a wooden building, took fire from the burning railroad, and for a time was in danger of destruction of the hotel and several fine buildings. The flames spread in directions where part of the horses were picketed to fences and trees, and a stampede was feared. It was a wild and exciting scene. The long line of fires and down the track were sending up volumes of dense smoke and lighting up the heavens with a lurid glare, whilst the flames from the buildings far upward and reached out as if eager for further destruction. The neighing and rearing of the frightened horses and hurrying to and fro, the men moved them and their equipment away from the fire, added to the excitement of the scene. The buildings burned down rapidly, and the danger of the fire spreading was soon over. General Rousseau, by his personal exertions, assisted in saving the residence of a widow lady who was astonished to find an assistance rendered from those she had been led to consider only as vandals. Men were detailed to protect the building with wet blankets until the danger was over. July 18th. Details working in the night destroyed several miles of the road. In the morning, the command was divided into 4 detachments to continue the work. Colonel Hampton of the 9th Ohio and his regiment and part of the 4th Tennessee moved toward Atlanta, destroying the track as he went. At Auburn, 6 miles from Lochapaca, his command was attacked by rebels, but after some skirmishing, he drove them off and continued the work. He destroyed a quantity of lumber and a large amount of quartermasters and commissary stores at Auburn. A mile or two above that place, a locomotive was met coming down from Opelika. The engineer, on seeing the Yankees, endeavored to back out, but the engine ran off the track. The engineer and 2 other men were captured and the locomotive destroyed. Major Baird and 4 companies of the 5th, Iowa, and 4 of the 4th Tennessee were ordered to march to Chuba Station, 12 miles from Montgomery, to destroy a trestle bridge and the station buildings, and work back, destroying the road. Colonel Watts of the 2nd Kentucky moved down the railroad from Lochapaca in the same direction, and Colonel Jones with the 8th Indiana started for Notasulga, a station between Lochapaca and Chuha. The detachment under Major Baird met a rebel force just upon arriving in sight of Chuha Station. The trains were on the track, which brought them up from Montgomery. Major Baird deployed his force on both sides of the railroad and met by the enemy in much larger force than his own. A brisk fight ensued, but the enemy proved too strong, and our men fell back with a loss of 1 killed and several wounded. 6 companies of the 8th Indiana were brought up, and an advance again made. Major Baird with 2 companies of the 5th Iowa, moving on the left of the road, supported by 2 companies of the 8th Indiana, and Colonel Jones with 4 companies of the 8th on the right. The rebels were met in Major Baird's front, and an obstinate fight ensued, but they were pressed back until they finally gained a position in a small ravine running down from the railroad, from which they poured a heavy fire upon our men, who could not advance upon them from the front without heavy loss. Both sides held their positions for some time, until the 2 companies of the 8th Indiana were sent across from the right side of the railroad, turned the rebels left, and got into their rear, pouring in a murderous fire with their Spencer rifles, while the 5th Iowa assaulted them in the front. The rebels were routed from their position and fled, leaving over 40 dead and a large number of their wounded on the field. The 5th Iowa lost 1 killed and 4 wounded, finding that the rebels were in considerable force and prepared to make an obstinate defense, and that to drive them completely from the road would require a withdrawal of a portion of the forces engaged in destroying the track. General Rousseau ordered that portion of the command back to the track, having in the meantime been destroyed several miles below Notasulga. Returning from Lochapaca, Colonel Hamilton's command was overtaken between Auburn and Opelika, and the whole division bivouacked from the right. So something we should also point out here, obviously Rousseau was one of the individuals who was very much on board with repeating rifles, so it is kind of fitting for him to use them to such great effect, obviously in this account, and it might be exaggerated, right? But in this account, it is saying that there's a lot more rebels than there are Union forces. And to combat that, they do have these superior weapons with better firepower. And obviously they use them to good effect here. So it is interesting how Rousseau goes to Washington. That's kind of what he's there for. He wants to create essentially a lightning brigade. Wilder eventually gets the lightning brigade. They do a good job at Chickamauga. And also in many ways, if you want to even look at it that even further, it's William Stark Rosecrans who wants to have these weapons. He has an army that's superior, usually, oftentimes more or less they're on par with their Confederate counterparts, but he's also a big proponent of these weapons. So Rousseau is seen sort of as kind of a disciple for him. He shows up at Washington at the wrong time. They get kind of angry at his presence, especially because they're already hearing enough of it in their mind from Rosecrans. July 19th, in the morning, Colonel Harrison, with a part of the 8th Indiana and the 2nd Kentucky, continued the work of destruction, and the rest of the command marched on a road leading to the route of the railroad, reached the Columbus Railroad, a mile or 2 east. This road forms part of the line connecting Macon with the Atlanta and Montgomery Railroad at Opelika. The 9th Ohio commenced operations on the track and destroyed as far as the junction, which they connected with Colonel Harrison, who had moved up the other road. A detachment under the direction of Lieutenant Colonel Patrick destroyed the depot buildings, turntable cars, switches at the junction, and several miles of track toward Atlanta. There were 6 cars on the track filled with leather nails and other supplies for the rebel army. 30 boxes of tobacco were also seized and issued to the men. About 75,000 rations of sugar and 30,000 of flour and bacon were obtained. After supplying the command, the remainder was destroyed. The work for which the expedition was sent was now thoroughly accomplished. Men marched over 300 miles in 9 days, penetrated 109 miles in the rear of Johnson's army, destroyed 30 miles of railroad track, with its depots, buildings, water tanks, switches, turntables, and 1 locomotive, a large number of cars, large quantities of supply material. As a rebel prisoner aptly remarked, it made a big hole in Johnson's haversack. The rapidity and boldness of the movement struck terror into the heart of rebeldom and caused such bewilderment that no serious opposition was made to the progress of the expedition. And there I think we can actually pause. They end up making it back to Union lines. It is a successful raid for Lovell Rousseau. And we'll go ahead and actually call it a day right there. We have righted Rousseau's raid that was overlooked back in July. Hopefully by spending the entire episode on it and really having an eyewitness account for it from a newspaper that would have been at the time published, I think we've actually done justice in going back to this Northern Alabama raid. That actually does have a pretty big impact on the Atlanta campaign, We talked about how there's a large amount of supply that gets destroyed as a result. Obviously, if you're the Confederates, you're going to probably want that. Next week, we'll actually do something different. We're going to talk about the Patreon episodes that we have had so far, which include several Civil War movies. Some of them are going to be more famous than others, shall we say. We're going to rank them, what we have up to this point, on two different metrics, right? We're going to average out the score here between entertainment and historical accuracy, and then we will rank them, of course. We will do that, and then we will also talk about some of the other superlatives that we have in connection with the Patreon, so stay tuned for that. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Questions, comments, concerns, feedback's always welcome. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.